right. Hello and welcome everyone to Open Office Hours. This is the time where we get together to do a live stream and talk with you about different startup concepts to help you get unstuck with your business or with your team or with your product, so you can reach your goals and be successful. Today, we're going to talk about productivity for founders. Andrew's going to share some of the tools and tactics that he's used to better organize, what's going on in his head, what's going on with his business here at Headway, and how you can be successful in leading your team and leading yourself. So, and as a reminder, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on LinkedIn, leave comments in the feed, follow our company page so you can see updates from us. And be sure to check out on our YouTube channel all of our past content. We have lots of great videos for founders, for product leaders in design, development, and strategy. So be sure to check those out when you have time. Lots of great helpful there. I think we have over 100 videos now on our channel, which is pretty impressive to think about all the things that we've done over the past 2 to 3 years. So, all right, I'm going to kick things off over to Andrew, and he can start talking about productivity.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, as you mentioned, welcome and excited to chat about this. This is something that, as a founder myself, over the years, I've kind of picked up a lot of different tools and tactics and things like that, and just excited to share some of those. Some of them are specific apps that I use that help add certain, clarity to what I'm doing, or augment, or just ultimately help me be more productive and focused and that sort of thing. So I'm going to cover a couple things high level, kind of zooming in, and really where this is starting is like, what should you actually do? Like, before you prioritize on a calendar or your task list, like, what are the buckets of things that you can actually do? And if you've dug into productivity at all, you've probably heard of the Eisenhower matrix, and that comes from him and from Dwight Eisenhower. And ultimately, the urgent are not important. The important are never urgent. And, he has this framework that kind of outlines that of, what are all the things that you have on your plate? What are the strategic things that you're trying to do? The things that are important but not urgent, those long-term things. And we'll kind of go over this really quickly. But, the important, urgent, these are the things that come up that are like, only you can do them. It's important. It's urgent. You have to do it now. You try to avoid, getting things into this box if you can, but there's always things that come up, whether you're procrastinating or not. There's things that ultimately enter into your schedule that you just need to take care of. And those are things I think I try to take a mental note of, like, what can we add a system for? What can we, ultimately change about the process or things to make sure we're avoiding that as much as possible. And some things are unavoidable. Some things just come up. The next kind of bucket is scheduling. So these are the things that are important but not urgent. These are the things that are long-term, maybe monthly, quarterly, weekly, things like that you need to do as a founder for your business to be most effective, and things that are going to help you ultimately move the business forward, things that are really important, projects. A lot of your work should be here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The non-important and urgent, these are things that not really important for you specifically to do. These are things that you can delegate to other people. And when it comes to delegation, it's hard for me specifically. And I know many founders who try to let go of things that are really close to them, or they're really good at, or they enjoy, things that give them energy. It's really hard to let go of some of those things, but this is also kind of a growth area for me and where I'm working as well. And so with our team and with folks that I work directly with, we've kind of ultimately established this five levels of delegation here, where ultimately you have something that needs to be delegated. What level are you really asking someone to do? What level of control, autonomy, permission, decision-making ability do they have? And ultimately, this is where I think a lot of founders struggle, and I struggle here, is like implementing this to the point. And it actually, this, just for full clarity, this is in a board that I share with folks that I delegate with on our team, on sales and on other stuff. Essentially, what are these different levels and tags when we're creating tasks or asking someone to do something? What level of control do they have, and what information do they need? There's a few other frameworks. There's one called the 5 C's that gives context. We're not going to cover that, but this is really about, like, what are the different levels of control and decision making does somebody have? So the first one is like assess and report. Hey, I know exactly what I want to do. I want you to give me some options, or I want you to go back and recommend some options. Assessment report is really just, hey, give me an idea of what you think, and we'll have a discussion. Number two is take that information and go ahead and make some recommendations to me on what potential path you think we should take. Level three of delegation is develop an action plan. So ultimately, choose one that you would recommend, develop an action plan to go ahead and bring that forward, and that's something that you would cover in a meeting. Number four is like, make the decision. Hey, you have the ability to make the decision, and keep me in the loop. So once you make the decision, let me know how that went. Level five is like total delegation. Hey, you have full control over any of this, and every single task or every single thing you do kind of falls into one of these buckets where you're asking someone to help, someone on your team for help. As your startup's growing, you try to figure out like, who's the right person on my team. If that person's not available, is there someone else who can help dig in and assess the situation? Hey, what are our options when it comes to doing some automation or doing something specific with our product? Things like that, where ultimately, if you can check more at Full Focus or just search the 5 levels of delegation, and there's some really good resources on this that ultimately will help you as you try to delegate things that are in this box to other folks on your team. Also really important, I know a lot of folks that will leverage a VA or an EA or other folks from their team that they'll work closely with. Being really clear around like what level of control they have, I think, is really important. And it's always for me, it's always a moving target, right? You might think that you gave someone full control, but it's kind of assumed, right? It's not fully explicit. So that's where I would recommend using these sort of tags inside of wherever you're delegating the task directly. Like, hey, just for full clarity, like what do you have the ability to do? Go on and move that forward. And then kind of the last one, which is the not important and not urgent things. Those are things that you should just delete, ignore. Things that, I'm trying to think of, like, these are things you probably want to eliminate, distractions. We'll talk a little bit about that. Things you just shouldn't be doing. So here's a quick overview of those. But one thing that I found, at Headway, we use EOS, and one of the other frameworks is like Delegate and Elevate. And those are things that they try to tie into your unique ability and things that ultimately you're good at. And I think, like, if you're later in your career and you've had the ability to contribute to product teams and product design engineering or different things, like, I feel like I've had that capability. It's hard to delegate things away when you feel like you enjoy them, you're decently adequate at them, you're good at them, you enjoy doing those certain things. And using this kind of 4 tiers of effectiveness helped me to think about it in a different way, and kind of 2 questions I think that helps you prompt, like, what should you actually be doing? So the first one is, what's going to sink the company if you individually don't do it, right? As a founder, that's sales, that's early on, that's sales, that's lead gen, that's, what are the main things you need to do daily, weekly, monthly that no one else on your team can do? They don't have the context to do it. They don't have the ability to do it. And then ultimately, like, what's your greatest contribution to the team? And sometimes these fall into areas where, it gives you energy, it gives you joy, when you're passionate. Sometimes they don't. And it's just a necessity to kind of grind through. And ultimately, that's part of being a founder, is like you're wearing so many hats, but understanding, like, what's your biggest contribution, what's going to sink the ship if you don't do it, is super helpful. And so if we look at kind of the 4 tiers here, this bottom tier ultimately is, things that are externally initiated, things that are lower priority, things that ultimately come to you, right? These are those things that maybe someone asked you for a meeting, or someone asked you for to do something specific, and ultimately it could be, you could delegate that to someone on your team. Ultimately, pass that forward, thinking back to the Eisenhower matrix. If you look at tier 3, these things are really meaningful, but not vital. So I think a good example of that would be, ultimately being able to, let's say you wanted to write a blog post for your company. Like, yeah, that's meaningful. You can share some insights, not vital for you to write that blog post. Like, you could essentially create an outline. You could work with some ghostwriters. You could work with folks on your team, do an interview, something that's going to eliminate how effective you are by doing that. You finishing that through all the way isn't really going to drive the needle for the business, but the concepts you have in your head, the main points, the outlines, things like that are super helpful. These tier 2 things are are things that are very important and strategic. So a good example of that would be if you're a specific host, if you're a host of like this, right? Like the open office hours, or you're a host of a podcast, or, you're kind of, helping create content that's recorded in your voice or your image or something like that. Like that's very important. It's strategic. You're probably, pushing things forward. You're pushing learning forward. You're building relationships. You're doing all these things, but not necessarily mission critical to your company as a founder. It's very important. It's tier two, but not the most mission critical things. And tier one would be, as a founder, like your job is to sell. That's to customers. That's to potential investors who are coming in your next round. That's the people to join your company and buy into the vision that you have. And so there's these different tiers of effectiveness where you can start to look at it through the lens of, hey, how effective am I being for the company? What's my greatest contribution? Where can I have the most impact? And you really take a account of the different tasks and things that you're doing across a week, across a day, and start to bucket them into here. I have a Notion list, a Notion template that I can share if folks are interested. Ultimately, with these tags, where you can start to really think through what you're doing. And when we get into the calendaring in a minute here, we'll talk more about how you then schedule these priorities. And there's a whole method for you to start thinking about, coming back to this. So, because things are always going to creep into your workflow. There's always things you're going to personally be interested in doing that you have to try and fight off as a founder, as an early stage member of your team. And ultimately, you have to kind of come back and rehone where your focus is. And then here's just kind of a recap and overview of some of those things. So now that you know what to do, or what you should focus on, what your biggest contributions to your company are, it's really important that you schedule your priorities. And Stephen Covey has this thing, has this saying: the key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. And this is all, being proactive rather than reactive. And there's always going to be some, no matter how good your systems are, how good your delegation is, or there's just always going to be things that come up, and you having the white space to account for those is going to be important. So a lot of people's calendars, maybe your calendar looks like this. It's meetings, it may be a couple workshops or things throughout the week as you look at it. But, I really think that and strongly believe in time blocking. And this doesn't have to be all work stuff, right? We're working in a world where there's hybrid work, there's flex time, there's all these things. This could be your time for working out. This could be lunch. This could be really, I believe in kind of accounting for all of your time so that you know where you can flex and where you can't, and you're accounting for the priorities that you have. So those tier one activities we talked about, or those schedule activities in the Eisenhower matrix, those are the things you should be scheduling on your calendar throughout the week, rather than waiting and saying, "Oh, I'll find some time to do it," and that never ultimately happens. And so there's also a problem of just doing too much, which I've been there in that scenario for sure, where I'm trying to contribute across many departments in our team. I'm trying to figure out how to let go of some of the things that I really enjoy, design, marketing, like a bunch of these things that ultimately are important, but they could be, really the tier one priorities for someone else on your team. And they're going to ultimately be able to do those better than you. So time blocking, I would definitely recommend just scheduling out all your time. Like I said, not just work time, but time at home, time at lunch, break time, things like that, that ultimately will help give you a clearer picture of how you can manage your time and your work together. The other recommendation I have is just batch meeting days into full or half days. So there's also a tool which I don't mention later, but it's called reclaim.ai. That'll ultimately help you batch meetings internally. So if you have multiple people on your team that are using Reclaim, it'll regroup and reschedule things that's optimal for everybody. It uses AI inherent in the name, but it also does something really cool, which is if you add something to your personal calendar, let's say your wife has an appointment, or you have something you need to be out of the office for, that'll then push it over to your work calendar and block that time as well. So you can use this time blocking across kind of multiple calendars and without replicating the work, which is good. The other thing is, like, I mentioned planning those priorities. So the schedule block inside of the Eisenhower matrix, the tier one effectiveness, tier two things that you're doing, scheduling time to work on those that only you can do. It's going to be really important for you to get meaningful work done. And so when you batch meetings together and kind of have that mindset, you have more opportunity for deeper work throughout the day. And as a founder, there's always going to be things that come up, right? Like I always start off with way more deep work time at the beginning of a week than I have at the end of the week, and that's because as a founder, like it's your job ultimately to unblock the team, and unless you delegate that to someone else or empower somebody to take action, like you have to step in and make sure that the team has what they need. The other thing is, and this is kind of coming from strategic coach, but what they do is plan out a lot of focus days where there'll be no meetings, and you'll have specific focus days where you're just working on the business, not in it. You're working on strategic initiatives. You're kind of taking all of that deep work time. You're probably working from home or working from, a coffee shop or something with no plan to hop on any meetings. And you're just focusing on, your strategic initiatives, those tier one and those schedule activities from the matrix. The other thing I recommend, and this is from Full Focus as well, which is Michael Hyatt. He has this weekday startup and shutdown routine. And I've used this kind of, if you have kids or have other priorities outside of work, which most people do, it's hard to not think about work all the time. And so when I do this really effectively and consistently, I'm able to better turn off from work. I'm not thinking of all the things that I'm doing. I'm able to really disconnect and unplug. And that's for things like, in the morning, like reviewing your schedule and meeting notes. So if you have external meetings, you're prepared for anything that's coming up. If you have specific things you need to deliver by the end of the day, you have your top priorities scheduled. And then when you get to the end of the day, kind of brain dumping that into whatever productivity or whatever to-do list or things that you have so that you can turn off you thinking about, I have to do that thing. I have to do this thing. I have to get back to that person, and start to really disconnect when it comes to the end of the day. That also sets you up for a good plan when you start the day of, hey, where did I leave off? Right? It'd be like if you open a book every day and you never put a bookmark in, you don't know where you started, where you left off. And you had to figure out, like, sure, you can figure it out. You have to go back and read a couple things, flip through, see what you recognize. But ultimately, this has helped me quite a bit. The other thing then is just moving into sources of truth. Like it's hard to work across a ton of different tools. And if you're working in product, you're working with like GitHub, or you're working with Asana or other tools. And so we have a tool that actually we've created at Headway called Birdseye. And I've been using this over the last couple of years as we've kind of worked on it internally for some new tech. You can actually go sign up. We're onboarding people now, but this allows me to add tasks at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, bring in stuff from Asana, bring in stuff from Trello, bring in stuff from GitHub issues, and then ultimately like prioritize my day based on that. So I can see across all the projects and all the teams we work with, especially when we're working with clients, how can I work across multiple Asana workspaces? How can I work across all of those things and make sure that I'm getting my top priorities done? And so the way that I have this set up to create a source of truth, if you're familiar with David Allen's Getting Things Done, he has like an inbox method. And what I use for Birdseye is my source of truth is like, I can create Birdseye tasks that are just for me. No one else needs to know about those. Those are like reminders, things like that. And then the way that it's set up today is like GitHub issues get created. Those send in Birdseye back and forth. Tasks get created in Asana. Those go back and forth. Trello gets created. And, all those things I'm able to prioritize across different tools and projects. The next thing here is, when I create a Google task, so this is something I'm creating from an email that has a specific deliverable that maybe isn't in a different tool, it isn't in HubSpot, that's connected through Zapier, and then HubSpot tasks are created through Unito, and those are kind of paired together. And then also, one of the things I find really effective is like on your team, people are going to ultimately ask you for specific things in Slack. And so not everything creates a task. Like I think if you're asking someone to do something in general, it's good to create a task for them and then share that. But sometimes you don't, right? It's so busy, it's a one-off thing. So I set up a Zapier integration that sends it to Asana that ultimately, if I bookmark a task in Slack, that'll remind me to review that and then take whatever action I need to on it. So you kind of see how all these different touch points ultimately tie into Birdseye. And just to go back, like that ultimately for me is, you have an inbox and then you have, hey, what you're planning to do each and every day. I found that to be super helpful. The other one that's a good source of truth as a founder is you're sending, this is beyond email, but as you're sending things in Twitter, in LinkedIn, in Instagram, and messages, and Facebook, wherever you're having conversations, that could be about, potential co-founders, that could be about people joining your team, that could be potential clients and prospects, is using a thing called Beeper, which is essentially Birdseye for chat. Essentially, it brings together all of the different message inboxes, not email, message inboxes into one thing. And then you're able to see those. So I think in the past, what I've done I think I got access to this 2 months ago. You'd, talk to somebody in LinkedIn and you'd forget to get back to them, or they'd respond to you and you wouldn't get back to them because you're not checking those things consistently. And this kind of brings that source of truth to you. So I found that to be pretty effective. This next kind of layer here that I want to go over is just like, what are the methods that you can use to eliminate distractions? At first, I was hesitant to do this, but I've been on do not disturb mode across my phone and my computer and watch and everything for the last, I want to say 3 years, maybe 4 years. At first, I was very hesitant of like, well, what if someone needs something immediately? And there's been a couple times where maybe it's been 15, 20 minutes later, I found out about something that was pressing and, able to handle it then. But it's usually not something that is going to stop the show. And you can always turn on do not disturb, and then you can set specific settings if you want folks, specific contacts like your wife or family members, parents, things like that, to still come through. You can still arrange that, which is helpful. But this eliminates a lot of the distractions day to day, right? I mean, if you look back at the calendar or think back to the calendar setup and you're constantly pinging between every single notification that comes up, emails that are coming, you're never going to get into that tier one. You're never going to be super effective or be able to ultimately prioritize your time because everyone's juggling and everyone's vying for that time. And so there are a couple of edge cases here that you still need to work around. Like when people call you, it goes straight to voicemail. I've heard some people are frustrated by that. So usually if I'm expecting a call, I'll just turn that off and, that way I won't miss what they're doing. Otherwise it'll kind of go to voicemail and go from there. The other thing is this self-control app. So if your mind's in other places sometimes, like around the holidays, you're kind of shopping around for gifts for your family or whoever, ads are coming up all the time. If you're looking at specific feeds, you can just download self-control and add whatever domains you want to it, and it'll block those domains. So you won't be able to access those at all. It'll just come up empty and say, hey, you're currently offline. And what this does is write into your console ultimately to block these IPs and things that are coming from these domains. You could also go the other way, which is an allow list where it blocks everything and it only allows specific things. It's kind of your own like little VPN that controls what you get to see. And you set a timer on it. And the only way for you to cancel that timer is if you were to go into the command line and override it. You can't hit stop. You can't hit, I changed my mind. So for the next 2 hours, you don't have access to anything that you put on here. So I would recommend that. It's a free app. It's something I use probably a couple times a week. It depends on mindset. Like if you're really trying to focus and there's still distractions or things that are, calling you, just turn it off, right? I think that's super helpful. The other one is on Slack. So, you can see I'm in a lot of different channels. And also, with Headway as the primary channel, it's easy to want to think about and look at every single channel and the chatter that's going on and keep up. But obviously like Slack can be the biggest distraction for you. So what I found super helpful is to just hide the sidebar, go to unread on there. And then when I come back and check it, I just see everything from all channels into one. I can mark as read and kind of go through that as like a, step-by-step inbox, and the things that aren't important to me, leave those channels or mute them or, whatever you want. And those won't come up here, which I found to be pretty helpful. So the next thing I'm going to talk about and kind of going to end on this, is just supercharging workflows. So as you look at, you kind of have a few things like email, and then there's a lot of things that you send messages to. And I'm going to set up a little demo here while I talk through this. But ultimately, like if you've used Superhuman or other things before, their goal is to help get you through email faster. And when you check email, how can you be productive? And so I found there's a few things you can do in Gmail to really help it feel super quick. You could say on home row, and ultimately, if you're familiar with Vim key bindings, it's basically, an ability for you to navigate through different sections of Gmail. I'll go through a couple of those. So the first thing is you have to, turn keyboard shortcuts on. That's usually off by default, I believe. So when you turn that on in general settings, you get the ability to ultimately supercharge what you're doing. The next thing I found super helpful is moving to auto advance. So when you handle an email versus going back to the inbox, it just sends you to the next email that you can just kind of rapid fire through. So you're keeping your hands on the keys. You're understanding, hey, how am I going to prioritize this? Where does this go? And then you're able to kind of like rapid fire through them versus going in and going out of each message. It'll bring you to the next one. And then the other thing that I think is really helpful to supercharge for me is using the label system. So some things like, I'll go into it in this next one here, but ultimately like need to reply. And this is the highest priority emails. Hey, I need to reply to this. This is almost the same as a to-do, but I don't always create tasks for them since they're kind of, a task list or a priority list in their own right. The waiting on reply I'll use if, for high priority emails. So let's say you send something to an investor, you're waiting for a response, or, you can always go back to this and see. You can kind of go back to sent and see as well. It depends how many emails you go through, what's most helpful for you. The other ones I have is for reading. So you can ultimately send something to reading label, and then you can set up an integration that ultimately forward it to Instapaper or your Kindle or things like that you want to read when you get a chance to kind of bulk assess those things. I rarely go back to it on my desktop and read through articles or newsletters or things like that. The other one I have, which I find helpful, is just sending things to scheduling. So any email that needs calendaring or looking at scheduling to happen or trying to figure out how things fit, I'll ultimately just send it to that and then like bulk do those together while I'm looking at my calendar, start to organize those out and be able to, either send a link to a calendar that someone can book on or just send the invites to those things. And then the last one is I found super helpful. Started doing this a few months ago, is for any newsletters, like setting up filters for anything with unsubscribe in it. So if it has unsubscribe in the email anywhere, it'll just send it to the newsletter tab. And then every now and then, probably once a week, I'll just kind of look through, hey, what are some of the newsletters that I want? And then I might add an exception, to kick that over to the inbox. The other thing, most use shortcuts before I get to it here is like, you can get them all here, which is interesting. They don't really have a shortcut link. They have a Google Answer link in their support, which has a lot of them. But navigating is like previous and next. It helps you go up and down the list. You can go directly to tasks by putting G and K. G and I goes to inbox, and then actions. These are the things that I use quite a bit. So when you have a message, like you can send it to the archive. A V will kind of drop down those labels so you can determine, hey, where does this go? Should this go to, reply? Should this go to something else? Shift and T will add a task. As I mentioned before, that sends it to Birdseye as well. X checks the box so you can basically select multiple messages at a time and then send those forward. C is for composing a new email. Shift and I mark as read. Shift and U mark as unread. And then compose. If you command and enter, it'll send the email and then go from there. Yeah. And then command and K inside of the composition, you'll insert links, which command and K is pretty common everywhere. So the other thing I like to pair with this as you're sending messages, and this is true in Slack, this is true in email, anything that you're doing repetitively. So even for like calendar invites that we're sending, I use a thing called Text Expander. And you can have an organization set up, you can have personal ones that you use as well. But ultimately you type these short abbreviations and then it'll expand the text for you. So if we're sending agendas for a pitch, right, in sales, or we're sending agendas for certain things, you could just type, or I just type pitch agenda and it'll expand that right in line. And I don't have to go back and type it or, reference anything. And this is shared, with the team as well. So you can get pretty, automated and consistent with some of those messages and customize them as you want, right? If they're a little bit different, now you have a starting point to be able to do that. So one thing I'm going to do here is actually um, pull open a sample inbox really quick, and then we can kind of chat. I can kind of go through some of those. But if you have any questions or even things that you've done that build upon some of these shortcuts, or would love to hear those. I'm always interested in figuring out the best way to, to ultimately get things done. So if you look at, let me share my different screen here. All right, so I set up a fake inbox here. And this is just a tag to be able to walk through this. But ultimately, using those commands, you can go up and down. And this split view is called, it's like a preview pane. You can turn that on in settings if you want as well. But ultimately, you can navigate up and down just like you would in like Apple Mail. Right now I'm going to hit E, and that'll send it to the archive. Since it's tagged, it's not going to do anything. But if I wanted to ultimately, send it to need to reply, I can do that. So I'm just using shortcuts to do that as well. So like need to reply, let's say I wanted to X out multiple, ultimately send those to, waiting on reply. You can see how really quickly I can just go through these and, ultimately like triage all of my emails. And so when you push out anything inside of your newsletters, things like that, you get the clutter out. Obviously you unsubscribe to the ones you don't want. You can see here, there's 18,000 over the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 months when I started doing that. But then you have these different, areas where you can ultimately manage. So I can hop in and need to reply to all those, really quickly. I can hop into scheduling and do that. But a way to keep your inbox on zero, you can see since this call, I've had 6 emails come through. So I'll have to go through those, but just a good example of kind of how to use those. It's kind of it right now. If there's any questions, would love to dig into those.
Yeah, I think while we wait for any questions from anyone watching on LinkedIn or YouTube, I have one question. What productivity tactics have you tried in the past, or tools or anything, and they didn't end up working for you? You're like, you thought it was going to be great, and you're like, you know what, this isn't working for me. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of any that haven't stuck. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention any of the, obviously on your phone, not really related to work, but related to screen time, as setting up those sorts of limits on your phone, screen time limits, things like that sometimes they don't stick, you know what I mean? Where you set it up, and I don't really scroll LinkedIn when I'm at home, with my kids, looking for things to do. I usually try to handle that stuff at work, but sometimes you want to check it, and otherwise you have to select ignore for today. I'd say that's probably one of the biggest ones. There's also, a couple techniques I didn't mention that are more common, like the Pomodoro technique. There's an app called Flow that's a nice minimal app that can be effective. I don't feel like I work best that way. I feel like when I go into deep work, it's more than 25 minutes, and I feel like I can just zone out and keep going. And taking the break kind of derails me a little bit. I know for some people, they swear by the Pomodoro technique. So I would say that's probably one that I personally went away from, just because I felt like, hey, if I have an hour, I do 25 minutes, maybe I feel really good about it, but it takes me longer to get back to it after that 5-minute break. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or after that 10-minute break, whatever it might be. And so I've found that to be counterproductive, just for the way my brain works and my schedule and kind of working in between things. That's probably the main one for me. Any that you have, Jacob?
I think for me, the other question I was going to ask, and I think sometimes I have to do this exercise with myself, is sometimes there's activities that you have to do that are more monotonous and not as exciting as other activities. Yeah. And, right. It's still, but it's but they don't feel as productive, but they're important. How do you get in that mindset of for me, I have to be hey, I know this is going to suck to do this for the next 2 hours, but it's really important, and it actually make everything else easier. Do you have any tactics on kind of getting yourself in the right mindset to do the work no matter what it is? Right. Yeah. It's how do you, because motivation's one thing, but I think like being in the mindset, like, do you have tactics around that?
Yeah, I mean that's one I didn't think to put it on here, but I call it power hour. So it's like all the
Mm.
things you don't want to do, like whether it's today or tomorrow, like you know that kind of like you said, you know that you have to do them. You can't really delegate into anyone else or things that are just
Yep.
monotonous. So like I actually have a playlist called Rally, which essentially like it, on Spotify is like music that gets me jacked up to just like blaze through
Mm.
stuff. So I'll try to like combine a power hour with that, where it's like, hey, I have an hour. Here's all the things I'm trying to get done in an hour. You just kind of rapid fire them and almost try to make it a challenge to see like, hey, I have 12 small things. Can I get them all done? You know what I mean? And like put that time pressure on yourself. Builds a little bit of adrenaline. Builds a little bit of conviction around trying to get through it. But I think that would be my tactic, right? Whether it's an hour or 2 hours,
Hmm.
like if it is, I would say if you have more than an hour, like a day of, those monotonous things that you're doing, I would say probably Pomodoro works well, where you're going from like low energy, not really excited about it, to like 25 minutes, you're going to pound it. You take a 5 minute break, come back, right? Like those really clear things I think would be something that you could combine well with that Pomodoro technique. But, um, especially if you have, more than an hour of those things.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The other one I was going to ask was, is there anything about like productivity that you used to believe, or like maybe like before you kind of became, like a business owner, and you'd read these productivity books and you're like, you used to believe one, like something that you were told all the time, but now like after you've tried it, you're like, oh, I don't really believe that's true anymore. Um, yeah. Anything like that?
Hmm. It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I definitely read a lot of them over the years. I think, I don't know, like anyone, I struggle with like stuff. Just it's easy to have a plan and be like, oh, I'm not working on that, and then like next thing you know, you come into your email and you have five things that no one else can do that you have to do, right? And then you kind of have to change your mind, your mindset, and you're like, well, I know this isn't where I'm most effective. I know this isn't me being most productive for the team. I either can't delegate it or I don't have, right. It's like, I think part of it is like, and some of the books say that around delegation is like the trap of thinking you just do it faster yourself. I fall
Mm.
into that a lot. I think of like, hey, I know it's
Yeah.
going to take this long to like train someone, but I've tried to use in that scenario like looms to say like, I'm going to do it this time. I'm going to record everything I'm doing, and I'm going to, review that with whoever I might want to delegate it with, or record feedback if it's something that's already been delegated that needs to be tweaked, right? Like, how can we use the tools at hand to try and figure out how to be more effective? And so, but I can't
Yeah.
think of any specific like mantras or thoughts or things in
Yeah. Yeah.
productivity that don't necessarily apply. I think it just everyone's different, right? Like
Hmm.
productivity for me is going to look different than like Cal Newport, who speaks a lot on like digital minimalism and deep work, and he has all those books. Like
Yep.
he's a writer, right? It's different than a startup tech founder who's trying to juggle clients, customers, investors, expectations, roadmap, all this stuff where
Hmm.
you kind of, you're just juggling quite a bit. Not saying that Cal, if you're watching, I know you're not. Not saying that you're not busy, but I'm just saying, like, uh,
Hmm.
there's a lot to do. There's a lot of different things, a lot of different hats you gotta wear.
Yeah, for sure. This kind of made me think about like meetings in general and how like, because obviously there's productivity throughout the whole day, but then like you talked about agendas for meetings and stuff. Like, what have you found has been really effective for being productive in a meeting? Because I feel like the meetings take up a lot of the calendar.
Hmm.
So like, how do you make those meetings more productive? And I feel like this is almost like a whole nother topic. Like, how do you have good meetings together, or how do you have less meetings and make them more effective and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I have I try to use this anytime let me share my screen. Anytime that I'm doing meetings, right? And uh, here's a good example,
Ah,
right? So like I use this text expander anytime I'm creating a meeting where ultimately kind of have these buckets in my mind, like, hey, are we discussing and deciding what to do? Are we discussing and like
sure.
diverging? Like, we're going to delegate? Are we going to debrief what we had and discuss the right plan? Like, ultimately decide. And then, like, I think preparation. Hey, please come prepared with this specifically. Please come, right? Like, these are the things that we're going to cover in this meeting. And then, hey, here's our agenda. We're going to discuss this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. an outcome. Like we're going to be able to make a decision on X. We're going to be able to schedule the next meetings to be able to, loop in the greater team or right. And like try to focus on, hey, what do we need before the meeting? What is the actual meeting going to be? And then ultimately what's the outcome? I try to use this all the time. I don't know if everyone reads it. I know like even at Headway, not everyone's in tons of meetings, right? Like if you're working with our clients on project stuff, like you're in workshops, you're in Slack, you're not in a ton of these different meetings. But I think, the a takeaway for me and for us as we think about it, like marketing and sales and what we're doing is getting people into the same system for meetings and what to expect and, timelines and stuff. Cause I think, I think meetings can easily get away from you, right? And even on, have some recent meetings where like we're done with the meeting, but yet we fill the time, right? And that can be okay. I think there's like a combination of like catching up, right, around the holidays and everything, and then also the actual meeting. But sticking to the meeting, making sure you're getting stuff out of it, I think is helpful. And I know, like Elon Musk, and there was some other stuff going around of their companies around like limiting meeting size. Like, we have one company-wide meeting a week that then breaks into smaller groups and stuff like that. But I think generally trying to avoid inviting people that aren't going to play a role in whatever happens next.
Yeah, I think something I've heard is like meetings shouldn't be longer than 30 minutes, but then like differentiating a meeting between like almost like a workshop session, right? Like sometimes meetings become workshop sessions and you're like, all of a sudden you're 10 minutes over, but like, hey, it's almost like if you find that and I tend to do this myself. I feel like I start to ramble about like, oh, maybe we should do this or that. What you should do instead is like stop what you're doing and say, hey, let's schedule time on the calendar to continue this conversation, workshop this thing, get the feedback from other people. Respect that meeting time because other folks might have a meeting right at the end of the hour or end of the meeting. I think be more mindful of like what is the definition of a meeting versus the definition of like a workshop time. I think even that would help us here. Like I feel like sometimes we're in meetings and we just kind of like get into the weeds where it's like, hey, we need to like dedicate time to this conversation. So
for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Looks like there's a couple, there's a question here or a comment from John. If you're John's on our team, CTO Headway. Thanks, John. If you're on macOS, you can also do this text expansion. Yeah, you can do it right on there. What I found with Text Expander is they have a downloadable keyboard on iOS. So you can actually install that and then toggle it. So then you can type any, if you need to do something on mobile or on iPad, it'll do that. Because I don't know, and maybe John, you know better than I do. When it comes to Mac OS. I don't know if it ports it between that with iCloud. If so, maybe I'll leave it. But I think ultimately what we've used it, like Brianna and her team, she has access to some of those shared ones as well that we'll use. So I think the team sharing is also valuable. But definitely, I know other folks on our team are using Mac OS.
It does work across desktop and mobile. Nice.
Yeah. So the only thing is like if you're sharing that with other people, right? That's kind of the other iteration is like if you don't need it to contribute with a team, then yeah, you can use that for free, which is great. So thanks, John.
But yeah, I think we can wrap things up. I don't see any more questions. Thanks for everyone that tuned in on YouTube today and on LinkedIn. Again, if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to either follow us on our LinkedIn company page or follow us here on YouTube, and be sure to check out all of our videos on our YouTube channel. Like I said before at the beginning, lots of videos. We have over 100 videos on our channel. Some of them are for founders, some are for design leadership, software development leadership, product strategy, kind of the whole gambit there. So if you're looking to even share resources with your team, be sure to share the channel with them and they can check it out on their own time. So yeah, thanks Andrew for sharing all of your wisdom today around productivity. I learned a lot. Like Miranda was even messaging me. She's like, I've never heard of half these tools. So I think sometimes it's easy, it's a reminder that all of us like have knowledge and like things to share. Because we're so caught up in our own world, we forget that like there's a lot of things that we can share with others. So encourage other people out there to share things that they're learning, whether it's with us in the comments, like share what productivity tools you're using and learning. We'd love to hear about them and talk about that. And maybe we'll use it here. You never know. So thanks again to Andrew and everyone joining us. Any last thoughts, Andrew?
I don't think so. Yeah, we can. I know Jonathan mentioned, if or asked if the deck would be available. We'll
Mm.
send that link out. We could probably add it to YouTube link here as well.
Yeah, I did mention because we can't comment on LinkedIn from here. So on the LinkedIn event page, I did say that we're going to turn this into an article, so it'll have more links and other things. So Andrew
Gotcha.
will be turning this presentation into an article soon. So there'll be that resource soon as well. So
That should be it. Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and hopefully you learned a tactic or two that you can start applying.
Cool, awesome. Thanks all. Take care.
Thanks everyone.